All right, guys. In this morning's video, we're going to look at the Introduction to Evolution notes. We're going to talk a little bit about Earth's history and the origin of life. We're going to look at this from an overview standpoint. Some of these things you will have covered in Earth science, so that will be a good thing. That will be a good thing to have a little bit of review. But let me get my pen working here, and we will jump in. All right. So, some questions we want to make sure we can answer. What was the early Earth like? What were the first cells like? How can we describe them? You definitely want to know what the endosymbiotic theory is. We want to know the difference between abiogenesis and spontaneous generation, two very different things. Excuse me. And we want to know the experiments that were used to disprove spontaneous generation. Now, something to think about when it comes to kind of the history of the universe, right? Before we talk about the history of the Earth, we'll talk about the history of the universe. The universe has been around for a long time, somewhere around 13.7 billion years, maybe a little more. And that's a long, billions and billions of years is a hard for us to wrap our minds around. So this is something that can kind of help you with that. This is called a cosmic calendar. It compresses all of known time into a 12-month kind of period. The emergence of the Earth is sometime in October, and then, human beings are like this last 5 seconds before midnight or so, okay? So cosmic time you probably talked about in Earth science. As far as how we know these things, or as far as just a review of the age of the universe, we know that the universe is expanding. We can look out with our telescopes and measure the rate at which galaxies are moving apart. If you know the rate that they're moving apart, you can put it in reverse, figure out when they were closer together. And so the WMAP program from NASA estimates that to be somewhere around 13.7 billion years. Now, as far as Earth is concerned, and the thing that we're much more interested in biology, is the formation of Earth and how things have changed on Earth over time. Excuse me again. So, big number to remember, 4.54 billion years ago is when the Earth is thought to form. So, unfortunately, because of plate tectonics, there are no rocks that remain that haven't been subducted or kind of chewed up by the movement of the Earth's crust. So that is an estimate, but it's a good estimate. It's got solid scientific backing behind it. And as we kind of move along, about 4 billion years ago, we have the beginning of the fossil record. There could have been life before 4 billion years ago, but again, because of plate tectonics, some of that early fossil record has been destroyed, if it existed. So 4 billion years ago is the age of the fossil records. We have 3.8 billion years ago, the tectonic plates are moving around, and we start to find chemical records that life may exist there. And as you move through, you can kind of read through these things. The big thing here is 4.54 billion years ago, Earth is thought to have formed, and our fossil record begins about 4 billion years ago. Okay, so what do we want to know that? Here's the age. All right, can we describe it? Absolutely. We have great evidence for what it was like. The oceans would have been boiling all the time because it was been super hot. All right, the dust and gas that coalesces in order to form a planet, when it does so, is really warm. So anything liquid on the surface can be boiling. There have been volcanoes everywhere, outgassing, so they're giving off eruptions, right? So gases are leaving the interior. There have been storms. There would have been a poisonous atmosphere to life as we know it, because there would have been no oxygen in that atmosphere. Now, the fact that obviously the planet starts in a lifeless manner and then has life on it is called abiogenesis. So how life arises from non-life. So the question is, where do those first organic molecules come from that life needs? So the first guy that kind of threw an idea out about this was named Alexander Oparin. He thought, well, maybe chemicals reacting could lead to life. And his is the idea of the gradual evolution of life from the primordial soup, right? Where there's just chemicals bumping into each other, and eventually you end up with some living things. Now, Miller and Urey are two scientists that took his idea and actually tried to come up with an experiment to see if it would work. So I'm going to show you their experiment on the next page. But the big thing that they did was they shocked this early atmosphere that they made, and they did end up with some organic compounds. So this was the setup for their experiment. Something interesting about Miller, by the way, I don't know if you know who Carl Sagan is, but Miller was actually one of the teachers that taught Carl Sagan. Anyway, they had their boiling water ocean, all right, and that water moved. They had gases from the primitive atmospheres, and we know what was in primitive atmospheres from samples that we found that contain gas bubbles inside them, and also some just good scientific work there. So you got your atmosphere here. You've got your water, your water vapor, just like we have today in the atmosphere. And they shocked it. They had basically like a starter for a car. They just kind of shocked the atmosphere, and then providing that spark, that energy, allows these things in the atmosphere to react. As they cool, they go down through this condenser, and they end up in this trap, and they could sample what was in the trap. They did find 20 amino acids that just were made from this scratch material. They found ribose, which is the sugar, that we've seen in deoxyribonucleic acid, right, DNA. And with more information that we have learned about the early atmosphere, we've redone this experiment, and we've even produced some bigger molecules that are important to life since then. Here's the big takeaway. The Miller-Urey experiment is the classic abiogenesis experiment. And this is what they said. You can make the ingredients for life from non-living things and a little bit of lightning. All right? So there it is. So what's the definition of abiogenesis? It is the original evolution of life or living organisms from inorganic or inanimate substances. And the thought is, this is not something that is a regular commonplace thing. It just happened, as far as we know, one time. So early life, what's early life look like? Well, we've got 4 billion years worth of fossil record to look back at, okay? And the earliest fossil that we find is one of simple prokaryotic cells. They're bacteria. They were anaerobic because there was no oxygen in the atmosphere. They were heterotrophs. They got their energy by eating things in the environment, all right? And these are some of the early fossils that we found. These two here on the right, these are fossils, okay? And they come from Western Australia. They're about 3.5 billion years old. And they are cyanobacteria. And cyanobacteria have been really successful. We find them in pretty much all layers of the fossil record. This is a modern cyanobacteria right here. They haven't really changed much. They're effective. You can see them under a microscope. So we find those fossils all the way back in 3.5 billion year old rocks. Now, stromatolites are another form of fossil that we find that were produced by cyanobacteria. So cyanobacteria has a tendency to live in a mat, like big colony just lays out. And over time, they just pile up on top of each other, and they end up fossilizing. And you can kind of see, each individual mat as it overlaid the mat below it. So stromatolites are pre-Cambrian, so before the Cambrian era, and we find those as well. I think this is also in Australia. Now, more complex life comes from mutations to those simple early organisms. And one of these mutations eventually leads to the development of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis puts more oxygen in the atmosphere, right? That's like the natural outcome of photosynthesis. You bring in CO2, which you would get from the outgassing volcanoes, which is, put out by volcanoes and would have been prevalent in the early atmosphere. They take that CO2, light from the sun, and water, and they turn it into sugars and oxygen. That oxygen they release, they don't use the oxygen, and slowly it builds up in the atmosphere. Now, the endosymbiont theory is this idea that larger cells absorbed smaller cells that could photosynthesize or use oxygen to break down food, and that led to the development of the first eukaryotes. So this is the endosymbiont theory. You have the early Earth with all these different kinds of bacteria, right? We got like 1, 2, here's 3 different kinds of bacteria. Some of these bacteria, right, this green one, can do photosynthesis. Some can use oxygen, right, aerobic bacteria. And the endosymbiont theory thinks that instead of eating and destroying one of these organisms, one just got trapped in here, and the products that it was making, that it was giving off, it didn't need, happened to be good for the other cell. And so over time, right, as it divided, it became part of the cell. Now, is there any evidence for this? Well, yeah, absolutely. The mitochondria, which is an oxygen-breathing organelle, has its own DNA. It has its own ribosomes. The same thing is true of chloroplast. It has its own, sections of DNA. It's got its own ribosomes. So the idea that this may have been the merger of two formerly independent animals makes sense, because we expect different organisms, right, to have their own DNA, not animals, organisms. Okay. Now, here is a 1.6 billion year old fossil of a multicellular organism. You can see the clear distinction between the cells. All right. And this cell has been x-rayed with some false color added so we can see kind of what's on the inside of that. This is very similar to like a red algae. And that was about 1.6 billion years ago. So let's look at this on a time scale. All right. So here's 4.5 billion years ago. And just so you're aware, 1,000 million years is the same thing as a billion years. So when you see down here like 4,500 million years, well, that's 4.5 billion years ago. Okay, so 4.5 billion years ago, we have Earth, all right? We have a lot of water on the surface. We get single-celled life that we see fossils of right there, about 3.84 billion years ago, something like that. Single-celled life has a good run, all right? It runs for, from 4 billion years ago to 3.5 billion years ago. So, 0.5 billion years. That's a long time. And at the end of that run, all right, we have oxygen being produced, and we have a period of massive photosynthesis. All right, look, you're talking 3.5 billion years ago to, we'll say like 2.2 billion years ago, 2.4 billion years ago, something like that. That is a long time. That's over a billion years of just oxygen being put out, okay? It takes a long time to fill an atmosphere with oxygen. Makes sense. At some point in this time, we have what's called the oxygen crisis, where there was so much oxygen in the atmosphere, it started to poison the anaerobes, and they start to just die off. At about, we'll say, 2.4, 2.2 billion years ago, somewhere in here, right, 2.2 to 2.4, if we're just looking at that line, we have our eukaryotes develop. Eukaryotes have a good run. You get multicellular life around 1.7, we'll say, billion years ago. Okay, and then we have multicellular life, and then, what's that, 500 million years ago, you start to get the Cambrian explosion, and that's where we get animals that we're familiar with. So if you look at this, the stuff that we're familiar with, the stuff that we're probably less familiar with, right? There's a whole lot more that you may not be aware of about the history of Earth, but it's definitely interesting, right? Definitely worth looking at. So here's a general timeline for you. Oh, we could have got our numbers off of here, couldn't we? So I'm going to highlight a couple of really important things here I want you to know. The first two, 4.4 or 4.5 billion years ago, formation of Earth, 4 billion years ago, end of the heavy bombardment, all right, and the development of the first life. That's a big one, okay, somewhere in there. We have photosynthesis for about 1.1 billion years till we get a good oxygen-rich atmosphere. We have eukaryotes in there. Make sure you know that one. 2.4 billion years ago, our eukaryotes are showing up. And then we want to flip over here. Animals, they've been around about a billion to 580 million years ago. MYA is million. years ago. Okay. We don't really need to memorize any of these numbers. Okay. Just know that between 1 billion and 580 million years ago, we get our animals start to appear. The next one I want you to know, this one we are going to talk about, is the KT extinction and the emergence of mammals. All right, that's 65 million years ago. Okay, and then 100,000 years ago, we have the Great Leap Forward, and we'll talk about that when we get to human evolution. Now, just when we talk about some of our fossils, this is one that's interesting. This is an opalized insect. You can see the insect right there. And when you're looking at these notes, in the notes at the bottom of the slide, there's a website where you can go kind of read about this thing. This fossilized insect is completely whole. It hasn't decayed at all because when it was opalized, like no bacteria could get to it. So some of our fossils that we find are actually really good fossils that give us a tremendous amount of information. So that's, one of the fossil record. When we talk about the fossil record, don't just think of like rocky bones. Okay. Sometimes it is, here's we'll just average it, right? 4 and 7 is 11. So 5.5 million year old insect in this opal, which is pretty interesting. Now let's switch gears a little bit. Let's talk about spontaneous generation. So we just talked about abiogenesis, the current scientific theory on how life arose. Okay, and we'll talk more about it later on in another video. Spontaneous generation used to be what they thought, or where they thought living things came from. And the key here, and this is the big key, this is what separates it from abiogenesis. They thought it was commonplace and regular. So the definition is the ordinary formation of living organisms without descent from similar organisms. So flies coming from rotting meat, not flies coming from other flies. The idea that living things could arise from non-living matter and that those processes were commonplace and regular. So science has come a long way since the 1600s, 1500s. One of the famous experiments that was used to disprove spontaneous generation is one you've probably seen before. It's from 1668, and it's the rotting meat experiment done by Francesco Redi. And so what he did was he had 3 jars. He put meat in one that was open to the air. This would be the first one. Meat in one that's open to the air. So air can come in, air can go out. He put another piece of meat in a jar, and he sealed the lid. So nothing could get in, nothing get out. And then he also did one where air could get in and air could get out, but nothing else. Okay. And he looked to see if maggots would appear, because at the time people thought flies came from rotting meat. People also thought that like mice would form from grain sacks that were left like in the corner in the dark. A lot of weird ideas about where things came from back in the day, right? So anyway, he observed flies coming and going in jar number 1, and then he, found the eggs, and he watched the eggs, and they became maggots, and he said, the flies laid eggs on the rotting meat, the eggs hatched into maggots, and then he watched the maggots, and eventually the maggots flew away as flies. He didn't find any maggots on the meat in jar 2 because no flies had gotten to it. He did notice that flies really wanted to, get to the rotting meat in jar number 3, but they couldn't. And so it meant that the air that got there wasn't producing maggots either. It had to be coming from the flies. So he did a really good experiment here and made some good observations. And this is like the classic argument against spontaneous generation. Now, Louis Pasteur, who you've probably heard of pasteurization before, he did an experiment in 1861 using an S-shaped flask. So this is a flask that's had the neck heated and pulled into this S shape to finally prove the whole thing was not even true for microbes, and that was the big quintessential disproving of spontaneous generation. So he put broth, like chicken broth or whatever, into a flask, pulled the neck into the S, and boiled it. Now, when he boils it, right, it's going to, form some steam. Steam's going to come up in here. As the steam goes up, it's going to cool, and it forms a trap, right? So you get a puddle of this boiled broth right there, and that acts as a stopper. Nothing can go past that. So like air and any of the microbes in the air can go in, and that's okay, but they can't go past it. They get stuck in this trap. And so he waits and he waits and he waits and he waits and he waits. And he uses like a big lens to look in here, and there's nothing. There's no living things. And then, all right, he does the same experiment. He boils, he boils, he boils, and he breaks the stem, and he waits, and sure enough, hey, microbes get in there. And that showed him, right, that there was something in the air, because air could get in, right, and that something was a microbe that could fall in there, and then it could start to grow. The other interesting thing that he did was he did a check. He checked the trap, and sure enough, he found that there was growth in it. And that told him, like, hey, there's something in the air that's growing here. So that fully disproved spontaneous generation, all right? So he is the guy that gets the final credit, but Francesco Redi gets the initial credit. It was his experiment. So science obviously supports the idea of biogenesis, the fact that living or life comes from other life. So in cell theory, we said that all cells come from other cells. Abiogenesis is a singular event, the development of the first life. It's uncommon, all right, but it's different from spontaneous generation. So make sure you know the difference in those two. All right, so hopefully you can answer these questions now. As we get into the evolution of life unit, if you have any questions, certainly send them to me, and I'll be glad to give you a hand.